Kasama si Pope Francis at ng buong mundo, pagkilusan natin ang mga panawagan ng encyclical letter na Laudato Si on Care for Our Common Home sa ika-5 anibersaryo nito. Sa linggo ng Laudato Si mula ika-16 hanggang ika-24 ng Mayo, magsama-sama tayo para sa ating common home sa pagkilos sabay-sabay dahil ang lahat ay magkakaugnay.
Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 4th webinar hosted by Living Laudato Si Philippines. And this is the 2nd webinar in celebration of Laudato Si Week 2020, celebrating the 5th year of Pope Francis' encyclical Laudato Si on Care for Our Common Home. So this evening's topic is called the Integral Ecological Conversion, Post-COVID19 Economic Recovery. So the COVID-19 pandemic has brought the global economy to a near standstill. Governments and businesses are unprepared for the impacts of the lockdown, creating a world filled with fear and uncertainty. I've experienced this myself, especially in a community that is all about tourism, and we are greatly affected. Now, how can governments and businesses work together to minimize the economic impacts of a prolonged lockdown? What are the roles of us as citizens during the economic recovery? And how can sustainability be translated into reality in a post-COVID-19 world? Thank you so much for taking the time to join us from your homes all over the world. I hear that we might be having guests from outside the country, so don't worry, we will be speaking in English, mostly. And also, just for a few house rules to ensure that our experience tonight goes smoothly and it's a positive experience, here are a few house rules that I hope that you will be reminded throughout the whole night. All right, so the first house rule is that you can introduce yourself in the comments, your name, where you're from, where you work, so we can feel like we can interact with each other. You can also talk about your insights. Be free to do that. The second rule is please be mindful of your comments. Please be sensitive that there are others reading the comments, and please feel the need to not offend anyone. Then lastly, if there are any questions, we actually have an open forum later, and there is a question and answer tab on the screen below you. So if you have any questions throughout the speakers' presentations, please put them there and we will answer as much as we possibly can later this evening. All right, so to begin, let us have an opening prayer.
A prayer for our earth. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace.
Amen. Hello, good evening once again. And let us begin with our first speakers who are coming from the Ateneo de Manila University on the Economics Department. So we have Miss Marjorie S. Moyrong, or Miss Majo, and Mr. Jeric Cruz. So Miss Majo is a PhD sociology candidate at La Trobe University, Australia, and currently on study leave from Ateneo de Manila University. While teaching at Ateneo's Economics Department, she has also been involved in a number of projects on climate change resilience and tax reform. Her earlier research engagements involved poverty reduction and sustainable agriculture. Her PhD dissertation topic under the Social Inquiry Department of La Trobe asks whether nationhood and solidarity have impacts on growth and development outcomes. She obtained both her bachelor's and master's degree in economics at Ateneo de Manila University. Now, Mr. Jair Cruz is a lecturer at Ateneo de Manila University's Department of Economics as well, and also the Department of Political Science, and is an incoming PhD student at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He is also a Fellow of Action for Economic Reform's Industrial Policy Team. Among others, he has led or extensively contributed to research studies commissioned by the Asian Development Bank, or ADB, among others, and the International Labour Organization, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Singapore's Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, and the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development on topics related to trade, employment, tax, industrial and investment, and innovation policy, as well as the political economy of inequality in Southeast Asia. He completed his master's degree from the Graduate Institute for International and Development Studies of Geneva, Switzerland in 2016 as the Institute's Prunier Foundation Scholarship Awardee. So without further ado, here are Ms. Maja and Sir Jair.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much to Living Laudato Si for inviting two of us here today. So I'm Majo Moirong, as introduced by Win, and I'm from the Economics Department of Ateneo together with Jerry Cruz. So tonight, we'll be sharing with you a set of policies that we dub as COVID Keynesianism, which we hope to help the Philippines and other countries around the world help define what the new normal should be for all of us, what would work for all of us, including for people who are more vulnerable, including people who are not doing so well in this pandemic, in these lockdown scenarios. So to start, perhaps an overview of the policy discourse in the Philippines would be useful for all of us. Last week, Secretary Carl Kendrick Chua had unveiled this so-called PH Progreso, or Philippine Progreso, Philippine Program for Recovery and Equity, with Equity and Solidarity. So this program from NEDA is a set of proposed bills to Congress, ranging from issues with tax cuts, as well as not only that, but also issues with investments for health, for food security, for agriculture. And we are very much supportive. We commend NEDA for this particular program, for starting the policy discourses, because it turns out, right, last week we were given this particular pronouncement from an official of WHO that perhaps we have to start adjusting our expectations for the next few months, even years perhaps, with regards to the pandemic. In other words, we have to start thinking of the possibility that the new normal involves the fact that COVID-19, even though it would probably get better, but it would also stay with us, maybe even permanently. So tonight, what we want to share with you would be how we can try to challenge ourselves, perhaps, as we try to face the new normal. How do we begin to shape or define how our next few months would look like? By thinking about what set of policies we must prioritize in terms of economic recovery, but also in terms of what we can do for each other in terms of our solidarity. In Filipino, we call this bayanihan, right? And aside from that, perhaps also in terms of what we can do to make our development trajectories more sustainable. So, in other words, tonight we're not just going to be talking about investments, but we are also sharing with you how we think investments should be more um, towards solidarity and bayanihan. And that is therefore an invitation to everyone to take part in thinking about defining the new normal. Of course, that's an overview, and Jeric will be sharing more about that later. But my task for tonight is for, well, to talk about more about the WHO pronouncement, actually. So before Jeric would discuss more about what we can do, perhaps it's also good to think about or to discuss with you why we think we must start thinking about the new normal. So obviously, we are from the economics department, and we know that you're expecting us to discuss what we think is the impact of the lockdown on the economy. So really, we all know that it's not just what happened this past few months. It's not just a public health crisis, but also um, an economic crisis, right? We're not yet there, thankfully, right? We're not yet in a recession, but economists have been saying that it might be there. There's a big chance that we are not. We have to think about recovery because economies are contracting. In other words, production is slowing down. Incomes are people are not earning incomes. People are not producing anything. And what we've seen in ASEAN, in some of our neighboring countries, was a growth slowdown. Meaning, compared to before, these numbers that you see here on your screens, 3.8 for Indonesia, sorry, that's Vietnam, 3.0% for Indonesia, 0.7% for Malaysia. Those are much smaller GDP growth rates compared to before. For the Philippines, for Singapore, we experience a contraction. Although for us, it's not so big yet. Okay? But in the second quarter of this year, we are actually expecting a bigger contraction. Now, focusing more on the Philippines, how do we understand this 0.2% growth? Because, negative 0.2% growth, right? That seems to be a very small number. But the thing is, okay, understanding GDP growth entails looking at the different sectors. And what we see here on the right side of your screens is that it was actually manufacturing that pulled down the economy and services that somehow saved us from bigger contraction. So we know that this is expected, this particular graph is expected because only food manufacturing had been allowed to continue operating, right? And hence that pulled down in the GDPs because all other types of manufacturing are not allowed, have not been allowed to operate. In terms of services grew because apparently a lot of those who can work from home, I guess some of you would be part of this group. You are part of the services sector who are highly productive, right? The BPO sector. So for instance, the BPO sector, the information and communication sector, that grew actually by 5.7%. In the first quarter of 2020 compared to first quarter of 2019. Then we have the financial insurance activities. I have my notes here. They grew by 9.64%. So that is the reason why we still have that positive growth for services. But then, what else do we know about the services sector? This is not just this sector involves not only highly productive jobs, but also our drivers, our service crew, our staff at hotels, and all other non-essentials. And hence, these are the ones, these are the sectors, the subsectors were also much affected. And what do we know about our drivers, our service crew, the vendors, right? These are workers who are mostly employed in our MSMEs. And as it turns out, while we don't have the actual numbers yet because we're still waiting for the results of the April 2020 labor force survey, what we know is that, for instance, 85% of total employment in private enterprises are in MSMEs. And according to this NEDA DTI UNDP Pulse, the survey, you can see my cursor, only 35% of MSMEs have been able to operate during the lockdown. And so we're talking about a big number of people displaced, right? Now, not captured by this GDP growth rates are our informal sector, and they also comprise a large number. They are 36%, a third of all our employed. In terms of farmers and fisher folk, not the data is difficult to get for their sector, but I'm sure that we've all read news about how much they are affected. There are success stories in terms of community action in some provinces, but most stories show that farmers, even and fisher folk, even if they're allowed to work, they're not able to sell their goods, their fish, because of mobility constraints. So we are in a very difficult situation because it seems like it's very difficult to open the economy because of the, 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 the difficulty of containing the virus. But at the same time, we are experiencing a lot of problems in terms of displaced workers and other issues with employment. And so what we have here is this question. I'm not sure if everyone is happy with this one, but in economics, we have John Maynard Keynes, who is uh, an economist, a father of macroeconomics actually, who teaches us that what we need to do in terms of crisis would be fiscal stimulus. And in all of this situation with the MSMEs and in the informal sector, current proposals, specifically by Salceda, Kimbo, and Garin on stimulus packages seems very much timely and important in helping with social amelioration and helping our MSMEs. However, tonight, this is not, we're not going to be focusing on stimulus packages to help our MSMEs. In terms of our discussion, this is not to say that we don't think that we should continue with this bill. Rather, what we think is that we should complement this bill from Salceda, Kimbo, and Garin with a new normal bill, which I will explain more in a while. So if we're not going to be discussing that, what are we trying to do here? What do we want to discuss with you tonight? In alignment with the policy brief of the Ateneo Center for Economic Research and Development and Ateneo Economics Department, Jeric and I have been thinking about what Keynes, or what it means to be a Keynesian economist in this particular crisis that we are experiencing. Now, just a bit of very short background. What is Keynesian economics? Keynesian economics says that if there is there is a need, then perhaps government intervention would be useful. If I can put it succinctly, we are now in a new normal, and that is now something, that is a situation that requires government action. The situation is, how do we better understand our situation? How do we better inform our decisions of our sectors? If coronavirus would not go anywhere, it won't be leaving us anytime soon. If there are issues with vaccine development and vaccine deployment. But then we've been hoping for a miracle, right? We've been hoping for that vaccine. And at this point, I guess Jeric and I would like to share with you the reality of how long a vaccine really, how long the development of a vaccine really takes. So according to this article from the New York Times, okay, under normal circumstances, a vaccine would take us until 2036 before it becomes fully available. According to the author, according to experts, we can shorten this. Okay? Don't get so scared. I can see you all. We can see your faces. Maybe you're getting scared now, but don't be scared because according to them, it would take. We could do a lot of different measures in terms of trying to fast track government approvals, trying to ensure that not do away, but do the development, even if academic research is not yet completed. There's a lot of things that we can start doing to lessen the amount of time. And according to them, according to experts, we would still have to wait until the end of 2022 before it becomes available, say, in the US, the Western countries. So in other words, according to this article, we also have to accept the fact that the vaccine might take a long time. And we, in other words, have to really begin thinking about the next few months as we open up our economy about what to do in order to shape our new normal without a vaccine. And hence, I guess this is where I begin showing you a preview of what Jerry could be discussing in a while, in terms of what it means when we say COVID Keynesianism. So let me just take a moment. I hope you are all not. This particular presentation is not made to make us feel hopeless. We can just put it that way, because I feel like maybe the previous graph is alarming. But rather, our message tonight for you, for all of you listeners, audience, is this is now a time for us to think about what to do for the Philippines, for the Filipinos, and other nations, right? To start thinking about what we need to do. And what we want, the other thing we want to focus here is that if you look at this, okay, we have to understand that preparing the vaccine once it's available would also require building up domestic capacity in the Philippines. If you notice in this graph, right, we had highlighted in red building factories and manufacturing. What does this mean? In other words, whether it would take just 18 months or not, a big thing that we have to prepare for in the country would be to think about where to put our factories and how do we start manufacturing the vaccines once they become available for the rest of the world. In other words, when we talk about COVID Keynesianism is really thinking about where to pour our resources in order to ensure that we are able to deliver these necessary things, these necessary programs, or in this case, a vaccine, to everyone in the Philippines as soon as we can. Now from there, okay, I hope you're feeling better with me slowing down a bit and explaining more about that particular graph from before. Okay. Another thing though that we want to show to you tonight is that when we talk about defining the new normal, given the scenario that perhaps COVID is here to stay and the vaccine might take long before it becomes available for everyone across the world, we also have to think about what that means for our economic recovery. And according to the Brookings Institution, we at least face 6 different growth or economic recovery paths. from something very optimistic, which I know you've been hearing, the V-shaped recovery. You can see my cursor, that's the V-shaped recovery. This is a Z-shaped recovery. So something like a U shape, a check mark shape, a W shape, or the most pessimistic, an L-shaped recovery. What do this mean? This means that for the case of the optimistic V-shape, it's just gonna be, think about pandemic as just as a setback. However, the other side of that is the most pessimistic scenario, wherein perhaps it's not something that we could just think of a setback, and it might affect our futures altogether, and we can no longer go back to the old normal that we had. So again, we are showing this to you guys not to feel that this is gonna be something that we don't know what to do, but rather it's a start of a discourse of discussions, so we can start preparing for our new normal. We're still not sure if the most pessimistic case will happen. I know we're all hoping and praying that the most optimistic will happen for all of us, right, around the world. But we have to prepare. Part of the praying, I believe, would be the acting on the actions in order to help us achieve the most optimistic cases. And with that regards, it's my the second to the last slides. I guess we want to explain further factors why we say that we can have the pessimistic scenario, perhaps we can have the optimistic scenario, and it means that we have to be able to prepare for both. I mean, in other words, what I'm saying is there are reasons to be optimistic. Okay, despite what I've shown you a while ago, despite the graphs I've shown you a while ago, there are reasons to be optimistic. Because for instance, vaccines being developed are at least 70 around the world. We have at least 200 curative treatments being developed around the world as well. So they might, we don't know, they might just be able to provide something in less than, we don't know. But perhaps it's a possibility given all of these efforts around the world. For the case of the Philippines, we can be positive that there are reasons to expect a V-shaped recovery if we can depend that the growth opportunities that we were excited about, the previous years, are something that we can continue developing. For instance, we have the Industry 4.0, we have the digital economy, we have very good export outlooks the previous months, right, previous years. And at the same time, I think the Philippine government, in terms of public finance and macroeconomic fundamentals, have done a very good job in ensuring that the fundamentals are in good shape. For instance, we have better credit ratings, we have better debt to GDP ratios. We've been able to actually maintain our 6% GDP growth rate, more or less, for the past few years, right? So there are reasons to be optimistic, and we should do our best to ensure that especially if you are in this, if you have some influence capacity to influence these things, that would be good. But at the same time, there are reasons to be pessimistic because, as I've mentioned about the uncertainties with vaccines, we have questions about mutations and how much our vaccine can actually catch up with mutations. And as we've seen from Singapore and with Korea, recurring waves of infections is something that we have to be careful about, especially that we are now easing up our community quarantine. Other thing is there are pre-existing recession risks around the world that is now being compounded with the COVID situation. There are issues with automation and reshoring, meaning we don't know if suddenly firms would think about moving towards automation as in response to social distancing requirements. At the same time, we don't know if we'll experience capital flight as Europe and Japan pronounces that they have plans to reshore operations of their activities. And in the end, another thing that we're concerned about is this uncertainty, right? that we are now in, all of us, we are in this situation of an uncertain global environment because we don't know yet how the next few months would look like really. So again, we are hoping for the best, right? We are praying for the best. But at the same time, we should also prepare for the less optimistic scenarios. And I guess to end my part, okay, what would J.M. Keynes do? What would John Maynard Keynes do? For us, what we need to do is to complement our stimulus packages with the new normal bills. In other words, we have to also start thinking about economic recovery. We have to start thinking about our sectors, and where do we invest in order to help our recovery efforts. And from here, I now turn you over to Jeric.
Great. Thanks very much, Majo. I wanted to thank Living Laudato Si and the Eco Jesuits as well for inviting us to share some of the stuff we've been doing over here this evening. A little bit also about myself. It wasn't mentioned in the bio because let me share this first. It wasn't mentioned in the bio because I didn't know what to expect with regards to the audience. But among other things, I also worked as an environmental activist at one point. And I'm glad to note that one person whom I have worked with in that capacity is in the audience. So I'm saying I have a shout out for Bing Carranza. I saw that you entered the chat room. So hope you're doing well. But either way, let me continue with where Majo picked up. Do you guys see my screen right now? Is it?
Yeah,
okay.
We can see your screen.
Great. So what I want to underscore with what Majo was previously saying is that there are reasons to be optimistic about the recovery from COVID-19. But we also need to be very prepared for pessimistic scenarios unfolding before our eyes. Now, in that context, we don't know which of these will manifest. A pessimistic recovery could look very, very bad. It could look something like the vaccine takes a longer time to develop. And then on top of the vaccine development, the virus itself mutates beyond the capacity of the vaccine to adequately treat. That doesn't mean that we would be in the worst of all worlds, because there could be curative treatments which would be available for that. But we also need to be prepared for such a bad scenario manifesting, even as we hope for better scenarios manifesting in that way. Now, the recovery bill presented by NEDA, by USEC Carl Kenrichua, is a very good recovery bill. In terms of the priorities, it will actually reflect much of the recommendations that we have to make. But in terms of, there's one characteristic which you want to underscore. It is betting on an optimistic scenario, like with most of our legislators. And this is understandable because we're already in a very uncertain, a very unsure situation. And government also needs to promote confidence with business, with the population, that people have a reason to cooperate in this very, very difficult time. But depending on how these scenarios unfold, what will be necessary in terms of government? If we have a more pessimistic recovery scenario, and this is what I show over here, this is an article from the MIT Technology Review last March, which emphasized if we actually do not go back to true normal and we stay in the new normal permanently, we may have to fundamentally restructure our economies for the foreseeable future. The kind of changes which are predicted go from one name to the other. But in this article, it's called the shut-in economy. We need to work via digital, indoors. Work and industries which require people to go and work closely together will no longer be viable, such as in retails and malls and so on and so forth. In other cases, it's been talked about as the no-touch economy, and some of you may have heard about that. But even if we have a optimistic recovery scenario where things get better over time, then there is still a large scope for these kinds of critical economic restructuring. Now, many of you guys, probably when Typhoon Haiyan, Typhoon Yolanda hit the Philippines in 2013, most of you probably had the thought, what would the Philippines be like if suddenly Typhoon Yolanda had not hit the Eastern Visayas and the Visayas in general, but hit Metro Manila instead. Well, now with the ECQ having been imposed in Luzon, we now know, we have a glimpse of what that would have been like. And we realize that the Philippines is extremely vulnerable to having Metro Manila really hit down by any major shock, whether that's a pandemic, whether that's a typhoon, whether that's an earthquake, what have you in that case. So what we need to do now, clearly, so that the Philippines will be more resilient, is to foster a critical economic restructuring. Our economy depends far too much on Metro Manila. And for all of you there out there in the audience who are writing either from Bulacan, from Mindanao, from the Visayas, we all know that there is so much scope for spreading out more opportunities beyond the national capital region. And this is exactly the main point that me, myself, Majo, and other colleagues of ours in the economics department have placed at the center of a recent statement that you come up with, which you call Reviving the Philippine Economy under a Responsible New Normal. We need to restructure our economy so that the opportunities are more evenly distributed throughout our country. And in that way, we also can foster a much more equitable recovery path compared to what economy we previously had. Now, which scenario manifests, and this is the point which I want to emphasize, the kind of policy you need from government can vary very significantly. To give you one example, if you follow what our economic managers have been talking about, whether it's NEDA, whether it's the Department of Finance or the Department of Budget and Management, they've all underscored the importance of build, 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 the Duterte administration's major and very ambitious infrastructure program. Build, 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 it's argued, is going to regenerate growth, is going to create jobs, which will eventually power the Philippine economy back to where we were before the pandemic struck. Now, what should we do with build, build, build? Unfortunately, it changes depending on what scenario you're looking at. If we're taking a look at if a vaccine is developed well, effectively, and it actually counters, most of the cases of the COVID, the pandemic risk across the world, then what we should do with build, build, build is maximize the space of government for spending on other essential areas. In other words, maybe we can try having government spend in infrastructure, but we might also want to consider its delivery under public-private partnership. Because what will this do? It opens up the budget of government for spending critically on health. We all agree that health will be very important. Education, digital services. And I'll show you more data on why digital services are really, really important. Even though we have a pandemic, there is no reason why we should neglect the schooling of our children, especially as the fourth industrial revolution is unfolding before our eyes. We need to prioritize essential sectors such as food. We're living, as Majo emphasized earlier, in a very, very uncertain trade environment. And in March, there was some fear that countries whom we depend on for rice, such as Vietnam, such as Thailand, would no longer export rice to us. So we need to find a way to ensure that we will have enough food supply for domestic economy. And naturally, because there's a global shortage across the board in terms of essential COVID supplies such as protective physical equipment, N95 masks, mechanical ventilators, testing kits, we need to find ways to be able to produce that domestically. And government may need more budget to be able to produce that. That's for an optimistic scenario. If we're talking about a pessimistic scenario, then we face a series of even more difficult questions in that case. And to give you one example, some of the most expensive build projects involve railways. There are also airport projects which are involved, and quite a few of them are dedicated to tourism purposes. But to give you one example, if COVID is not contained, if a vaccine doesn't work, that will mean that air travel will be restricted for years to come. And in that case, will it make sense to spend government money on airport projects? Mass commuter rails. For those who are in the know, mass commuter rails are some of the most difficult projects to keep economically viable. They're extremely expensive. Governments regularly need to subsidize them. We do that with the MRT and the LRT. And practically every government across the world which has a train needs to subsidize them. That's assuming that you have normal commuter traffic. But if you need to enforce social distancing, then that raises the question, how are these trains going to make enough economic return to be able to pay for their bill? That will require government to massively pay for them, ultimately siphoning off funds which could be used for other essential areas of the economy. And the same thing with airport projects applies to tourism. If air travel is restricted, people are not able to move around as much, will tourism be a viable sector? Probably not. And in such a scenario, projects across all these areas may need to be deferred, reviewed, possibly even discontinued, precisely because we will need every single peso that we can to be able to go to the essential sectors of the future. Now, a big challenge which we faced, and this is an analysis which me and Majo have done using what data which we have from the Philippine government. Where should we spend our money, especially if we're concerned about re-employing the workers who were displaced throughout the pandemic? And as Majo said, several million Filipinos may need to get new jobs because of the situation. So what we did is that we simulated through all the sectors in these tables how much spending 1 billion pesos would generate in terms of jobs, and that's in the blue one, as well as jobs specifically among the poor. So you see that these are for all the different sectors. Now I won't go to all of them specifically, but I did want to highlight the following 3 major trends. If we're looking, number 1, at all the jobs in general, which have the most promising effect in creating employment based on our simulations, and as well as jobs which are experienced particularly among the poor, by far and away it's agriculture. Agriculture is king in terms of creating jobs for Filipinos. That augurs very, very well. For the long time, a significant chunk of Filipinos, 1/3, are still in the agriculture sector. They're heavily poor, they're extremely poor, but they've been highly neglected for the past few years. This is an opportunity for us to build agriculture as a vibrant sector, and in so doing, lift the rest of our countrymen out of poverty and offer viable livelihoods for Filipinos who have been displaced. A second area, and a second takeaway, investments in the garment and health sectors also have a very, very high impact on job creation. And this augurs very, very well if we want to expand our health sector to be able to counter the pandemic. We can create jobs, whether in the medical sector, we can also create jobs in the broader public health sector. We can even create jobs in areas which also produce supplies for responding to the pandemic, such as the garment sectors where currently we're producing protective and physical equipment. So all of this focusing on responding to the pandemic is a good strategy as far as creating jobs for our displaced workers is concerned. And also a last thing, like build, we find that construction and land transport also have very, very high effects. So this indicates that if we're talking about build, there is some scope for it. Maybe we will have to cut down some projects to open up government funds for spending in other areas, but there is a place for construction and for fixing our public transportation system in a long-term response to the pandemic. So we took a look at the details. And what we did in this case, we tried to ask ourselves, what would it be like if we spent 1 trillion pesos, say, in the construction sector? And we think this is realistic because what happens is the current budget for Build, the infrastructure program, is 989 billion pesos this year. So this kind of simulates how much would it be if we spent for that. And we find very promising results. Spending this much on construction and infrastructure could very much massively boost the economy out from our current ditch. And that's precisely why we're seeing over here it can stimulate as much as 7.6% of our GDP in 2018. What we find, in fact, there are critical sectors that you find: banking, education, land transport, chemical products, so on and so forth, which will also be stimulated by this in particular. All the sectors over here, these are the sectors which are most stimulated because sectors are interconnected. To be able to create an infrastructure project, you'll need steel, you'll need concrete, you'll also need chemicals. So this represents how much the catalytic effect of this will be in terms of those other sectors, in terms of economic output. But more interestingly, we did the same thing with health. And what we found was as follows. Health is not as pronounced when it comes to the question of promoting, economic activity. Compared to the 7.6 of construction, health is 6%. It's still high, but not as high as construction. But here's the kicker. I want you guys to take a look on the left side of the chart. All the capitalized areas, other crops, fisheries, coconut, warehousing, all the way down to land transport and health services. These are the other essential sectors that we need to take a look at, that we need to prioritize as we respond to the pandemic. And what do we find? We find that compared to construction, there are more essential sectors that are stimulated when we're talking about investing in health. So investing in health has the double benefit, not only of strengthening our pandemic response, but strengthening all the other sectors that we will need when it comes to getting through this very, very difficult crisis that we are in over the next few years. To give you one reason, why is it that other crops, fisheries, coconut, palay, corn, why is all these food involved? And one word, nutrition. The health services industry needs to provide nutritional services as well, and that's why they require a lot of food inputs relative to, say, construction in that case. Now we go on to what our proposals are, and some of these have been already adopted by government, but some of them have not yet been, and we want to really push the envelope in that case. Now, there's a no-brainer here. We need to focus on health. There's no question that we need more treatment capacity. We need to be able to mass test. We need to be able to contact trace. We need facilities for isolating people. But as Majo emphasized earlier, we also need to begin preparing the production as well as the distribution of vaccines locally. It is the single longest step in terms of delivering a vaccine to all people of the world, and the Filipinos included. So the fastest way we can make it sure that it will happen sooner is to start already, as of this month. We need also more productive capacity to create essential COVID supplies. There is a global shortage. We need to find ways, the garment firms, to produce more protective physical equipment. We need textile firms to be able to produce masks, like the testing kits which has been developed by UP. They also need to have stronger capacity for that. But there's another reason why we need to focus on health. And I want to focus on the right chart, which I put over here. If you take a look at the level of inequality in terms of health expenditure across the Philippines, and we took a look at some data here, how much households spend in terms of health is extremely unequal in terms of the Philippines. I won't go over the details, but it has a Gini index of 80.6. To put that in perspective, our level of inequality for income, lower is better, higher is worse. Our level of income is in around 40 to 44%. Health is 80.6. That's the level of inequality in countries such as South Africa. When it comes to health, we are, as South African, we're a country as unequal as the worst countries in the world when it comes to this kind of case. And this is a security risk when it comes to COVID. Everybody can get infected when it comes to the pandemic. And if some people cannot access health services, so other people, that raises the risk that all of us could eventually get the disease because of its contagiousness. Let's go to the next one. As we emphasize, agriculture and agro-industry are extremely promising. In fact, the most promising sector when it comes to creating jobs, not only for ordinary Filipinos, but for the poor. And it turns out there are three major roles that we can see for this. It's a no-brainer. Food supply. We need food for everyone. It's also a no-brainer that we need to find sectors for displaced workers who will not be able to find work, that they can find employment again. And agriculture is particularly promising for that. But if you look a little bit more beneath the surface and do your research, what you find is that agriculture has tremendous promise to provide raw materials, which we could need in facing this pandemic and building a sustainable future, which I believe Laudato Si and EcoGest stand for. To give you some example over here, I take some newspaper articles on the left. You all know abaca. It's made from a variety of bananas. Would you believe that Philippine abaca is a major source of materials for protective and physical equipment worldwide? Another one. Would you believe that it's a bit, some people may quibble about this, but corn, cassava, seaweeds, mango, pineapple, even rice, but probably will not ask rice. All of these can be converted to something called polylactic acid, which can produce bioplastic, which can in turn be used to create N95 masks. And just recently in the United States, there has been a way using bioplastic to create compostable N95 masks using bioplastics. And we can expect from the COVID situation that there will be a massive wave of plastic waste across the world. We need to find ways to make that more sustainable. Now, going beyond just COVID supplies, we can also talk about the construction sector since we're emphasizing build, build, build. And it turns out there's been a whole wave of innovation in terms of sustainable construction materials, whether you're talking about bamboo, whether you're talking about coconut. And coconut husk, believe it or not, is thrown away by farmers, by coconut farmers. You can turn it into a replacement for wood. This is one example which has been adopted by government during the Aquino administration.
I know.
In terms of coconuts, it's very good at soil erosion. Now, the idea for other kinds of sustainable construction products, can we find ways to engage our farmers, our poorest farmers in the coconut sectors, by finding ways to integrate them in the production of materials for construction, especially the build, build, build. We're in the last 3 slides, so I hope you guys who are not too tired yet. But other important thing over here, build, 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 as we said, yes, it's important, but we need to realign it because there are some questions about whether some of them the projects will be viable. We need to spend on social infrastructure. We need to support agriculture, to spend on rural infrastructure, to help improve agricultural productivity. But if there's anything that COVID has shown all of us, it's how unequal we all are in terms of our access to digital infrastructure. And I take some data here from the Economist Intelligence Unit, which compared the Philippines to 14 other countries in the Asia Pacific region. Suffice it to say, digital infrastructure, ICT, broadband cost and speed, we are at the bottom rung. That is a major impediment. If we continue with this pandemic and we do not fix our infrastructure situation with regards to digital, that could be a reason for increased inequality in the future as well. And last element, which we wanted to emphasize, the COVID offers us a big opportunity to fix up our public transportation system. And I show you guys on the left side, these are the number in a 2013 study of the redundant routes being applied by bus companies in Metro Manila. We've all heard about it. Like buses stop and they hold up traffic. And there's 2 reasons for that. Reason number 1, the bus companies are uncoordinated. So they focus on routes which all have a large passenger traffic. So no question that they have extremely redundant routes. And secondly, drivers are paid by the passenger. So drivers have an incentive to hold up and basically try to get as many passengers on board, which creates a massive amount of traffic. As you all know, all of us have seen it in terms of bus stations. Now, we need to rationalize the routes. We need to pay drivers a living wage, but also the situation offers us an opportunity for really shifting to green public transportation. Our public transportation vehicles, we can make them electric. We can give more priority to buses in terms of bus rapid transit. We can strengthen our infrastructure for non-motorized transport, such as bicycles, as well as walking lanes, so on and so forth. Our last slide here. Just the most important thing through all of this that we need to emphasize, and this is exactly what Majo is saying, is that we need to have solidarity in the middle of this whole situation. COVID is a pandemic. All of us can get it, whether we are rich and poor. Now, that brings us, it makes it imperative for us to address the vast inequalities that we have in the Philippines right now, because we cannot leave anyone behind. If you look at the stories, say in Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, if the poor were still left behind and neglected, it turns out they were the next source of the next infection wave. In the same way, we can no longer have the same status quo that we had before. The pandemic is a wake-up call for all of us, that we need to move to more equitable, inclusive, and sustainable economy. And if you have more questions about how we can move in that direction, we'll be happy to entertain more of those in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Majo and Sir Jarek, for sharing with us this side of economics that we don't get to see usually. It's very refreshing to hear actual solutions that we can take in the future to this new normal, rather than just worrying about it with anxiety. You've given us this new hope that we can look forward to, that there are possibilities that we can achieve if we all work together and if we listen to how this situation is talking to us. And now we move on to our next speaker. we have Sir Rodney Galicia, our Executive Director of Living Laudato Si Philippines, to introduce the final speaker and as well as talk about the Laudato Si. Sir Rodney.
Thank you, Winkin. And of course, first of all, I would like to thank Ateneo de Manila University and the Department of Economics for saying yes to this session. And we're thankful also with the Eco Jesuits, to Brex and everyone for joining us in partnership also with Christian Aid. And Ms. Jack will be joining us later. As you all know, this session is part of the Laudato Si Week 2020 because we're actually commemorating the encyclical letter of Pope Francis that was written 5 years ago. This week, we focus on that, the 5th year of Laudato Si on Care for a Common Home. Living Laudato Si Philippines is part of the Global Catholic Climate Movement, and many organizations in the Philippines are actually organizing many online events for this Laudato Si 2020. For Living Laudato Si Philippines, we envision that Laudato Si will be a way of life, and with that we can have a sustainable future, and we commit to build capacity and form more partnerships in mainstreaming the principles of Laudato Si as framework and tool for sustainable development. And would like to work with faith-based organizations, NGOs, CSOs, and the government to divest from destructive industries and shift towards financing solutions that promote sustainability and social justice. And that includes, of course, our post-COVID-19 strategies. And I'm proud now and honored to actually introduce our next speaker. He's one of the most respected Jesuits in the country. He works in community land management and disaster risk reduction in Southeast Asia, who has a people-focused approach to capacity building and seeks to promote more lasting partnerships through research, consultation, and policy building to support local populations and governments. He teaches a course on integrating human development in natural resource management for Asian graduate students of the UN-mandated University for Peace and the Ateneo de Manila University. He is currently coordinating a series of regional dialogues aimed at shaping an integral response to the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. He is the coordinator of Eco Jesuit, the global ecology network moving an ecological agenda and exploring collaboration. So, brothers and sisters and brothers, please welcome Dr. Pedro Walpole of the Society of Jesus.
I suppose I want to take a pause after all of that and take even a further step back, because this is Laudato Si Week. It's a week where we start not from promises, but from conversion. And I think our hope comes from that point of conversion. We're talking of economy, the origin of which is oikos, the origin of which is given to ecology as well as economics, and the balance that is there. COVID is an ecological problem. It's an ecological crisis. Okay, we are removed from the food markets of China, but we are connected because this is global. And we really need to understand that getting the market back online is not simply a matter of production, but a matter of balancing the production. So there are many good examples that are given, but why the farmers throw away the coconut husks of coconut is that nobody pays them for it. So farmers, most fundamentally, need actually to be paid. We need to understand that farmers are professionals. we don't include them in the category of professionals. But not anyone can go out and grow food for us. We've all tried perhaps experiments in little containers in an urban livelihood, but it's limited what we can grow. So as we look towards a new economy, and we see what's happened in COVID, which really has exposed the vulnerable. Millions of people, billions if we look around the world. COVID has exposed that vulnerability, particularly in cities and in areas of health. Yes, everybody is exposed to COVID, but the poor are exposed more. So we're talking actually tonight very good insights into how a new paradigm of economics needs to come about. And there are some very good evaluations there. But actually, the paradigm has to change. We have to stop borrowing from the environment out there, understand how we've got to redesign how we live in the environment, and build an economy around living better. Not necessarily having more, but living better. And the people who need to live better, there were some very good figures there as to how disproportionate access and living standards are in the Philippines and in the world. So we're really challenged because, okay, Ambo was a fairly light typhoon, and many communities suffered with flooding and other experiences. However, we are online for a major round by next year. We had temperatures in Mindoro of 56 degrees centigrade. That is massive. 56 degrees centigrade. And people cannot turn on air conditioners. And even if they do, their crops will fail in those temperatures. So we have to build the ecology into this economy. We have to build an integrated ecology into this economy. I live in the mountains and we grow abaca, but we only get 24 pesos a kilo, and we might walk 3 days over the hill to deliver that. The price of abaca may go up, but the price the farmer gets doesn't go up. So we're gravely challenged. Corn for animal feeds has taken over Mindanao in the uplands. And farmers don't have food to eat. So they steal from their own harvest and eat pesticides. It has poisoned their water sources. So if we really want to bring a balance into the economy, we have to focus not just on large industry helping us survive, we have to also give a share to small business and medium-scale business. So it was very well put. We have to look at manufacturing beyond Manila. These are crisis situations, and we also have to have the access to health, which is so urgent. So many of the health clinics don't have the capacities that they need to serve the people. So we need to strengthen that. Where can I go with this in response to the challenges we've got, and in part where the church is? The church needs to be able to accompany its people. And we always talk of faith, but we talk of faith, hope, and love. And we've seen that love. We've seen a huge amount of compassion, yeah, that has gone out. Bayanihan is another expression of it, culturally, a certain solidarity. And we need to see that action too on the ground. It's not government alone that solves this. It's also our ability to come together and to be unified, not to be divided. Yeah? We have to come in a unified and inspired manner as community, as province, as country to respond to this. So these are the challenges that Laudato Si, as it were, reinforces and tries to bind together. Hopefully, as we come through COVID, also the IATF will be able to respond to many of the problems we have on the ground. It's very clear, you know, we're going to go from crisis to crisis. We're only entering the rainy season. Yeah? How are we going to respond? Yeah, so we have another average 19 typhoons ahead of us. So we've got to make sure that responding to COVID doesn't get interrupted by these. We've got to build an economy that especially helps us build back better, not build back to the same norm, but we have to build to a better norm so that then we can focus on other communities and help them build back better. We have to have food there. And our local food accessibility is most important. Okay, I'm going offline at the moment because I have no power.
Hello, Father, we can still hear you, but.
Yeah, but I don't seem to charge anymore. Okay, that should be back on. Okay, so you won't have to look at me from another angle now. Yeah, maybe you have questions. It would be much better if there were questions rather than talking at this stage. Yeah? Have you got some dialogue going there with people? There's a lot of people out there, and it's they've had a long listening already.
Yes, we have quite a few questions.
Okay, do you want to field some of those questions? To different people, I mean, not to me, but to the economists we have.
If you want to move on to open forum, Father?
Maybe that's good, because I don't think people can take more input. What they need to is offload a little. And
very true, yes.
Yeah.
All right. I will allow me to introduce Ms. Jessica Dator Bersilia to moderate the open forum.
Sumainyo ang kapayapaan. #Buhay Laudato Si. Sa panahon ng COVID-19 pandemic, ang maging isang responsableng mamamayan para sa kalikasan ay napakahalaga. Tandaan natin na ang kapaligiran ay hindi lamang ang inang kalikasan, kundi ang mga kapwa na kumain ng tamang pagkain at uminom ng maraming likido o tubig at kinakailangang bitamina. Huwag kalimutang mag-ehersisyo. Pangalawa, alagaan ang kalusugan ng iyong kaisipan. Iwasan ang sobrang pagdamdam at pag-iisip ng mga kwento at balita tungkol sa pandemic, kabilang dyan ang social media. Maaari mo ring gawin ng mga bagay na nakapaglilibang sa iyo na hindi nakapagdudulot ng stress at pagkabalisa. Pangatlo, panatilihing malinis at ligtas ang iyong sarili. Huwag kalimutang maligo. Panatilihin ang personal hygiene at ugaliing maglinis ng bakuran at ng inyong tahanan. I-segregate ang mga basura at i-compost ang mga nabubulok. Pang-apat, turuan ang iyong sarili at ang iba pa tungkol sa COVID-19 pandemic. Alamin ang pinakabagong mga balita at makinig sa payo ng mga profesional at ng mga eksperto. Iwasan ang pagbabahagi ng fake news and information kahit ano paman ang mangyari. Panlima, maging isang responsableng mamimili. Kung pupunta sa palengke at bibili sa grocery, iwasan ang single-use plastics and paper. Iwasan din ang pag-aaksaya ng pagkain, tubig at iba pang mga gamit sa oras at pagkatapos ng community quarantine. Patayin ang ilaw kung hindi naman kinakailangan at bawasan ang paggamit ng kuryente. Pang-anim, alamin at mag-aral ng mga bagong kasanayan o skills. Maaari mong subukan ang pagtanim at pagpalago ng iyong sariling pagkain tulad ng gulay sa iyong bakuran, magluto ng mas malusog na pagkain o mag-aral kung paano pangalagaan o ikumpuni ang ating mga appliances. Malay mo, mayroon ka palang tinatagong talento na dapat mong tuklasin. Pampito, makipag-usap at gumawa ng mga aktibidad na makapagpapalakas ng inyong pagkakaisa at pagmamahalan ng pamilya sa loob ng tahanan. Of course, ang physical distancing ay dapat isaalang-alang. Pangwalo, huwag kalimutan ng ating mga kapatid na mas nangangailangan upang sila ay makasurvive araw-araw. Ang ating mga frontliners, ang mga nawalan ng hanap buhay, at ang mga walang makain. Magbahagi ng mga blessings. Mag-donate online o sa mga lehitimong mga organisasyon. Pangsyam, sundin at igalang ang mga panuntunan at mga bilin ng mga otoridad upang mapigilan ang malawakang paglaganap ng virus. Huwag mahiyang magtanong kung hindi malinaw ang mga patakaran. At huwag kalimutang idokumento at i-report kung may paglabag sa mga karapatang pangtao. At pangsampu, manalangin. Ipanalangin matapos na ang dilubyong ito. Tuloy-tuloy na panalangin. Idalangin natin ang mga frontliners at ang mga naapektuhan ng COVID-19 at ang kanilang mga pamilya. Alam natin na hindi tayo pababayaan ng poong may kapal. Ito ang sabi ni Pope Francis. Gayunman ang edukasyong ito na naglalayong lumikha ng pang-ekolohiyang pagkamamamayan, paminsan-minsan ay limitado sa pagbibigay ng impormasyon at nakakaligtaang makapaghasik ng magandang kaugalian. Ang pag-iral ng mga batas at patakaran ay hindi sapat sa katagalan upang supilin ang masamang pag-uugali, kahit na naruroon ang epektibong paraan ng pagpapatupad. Kung magdadala ang mga batas na ito ng makabuluhan at pangmatagalang epekto, dapat na nakararami ng mga kasapi ng lipunan ay maudyok silang sapat na matanggap ito at magkaroon ng personal na pagbabago upang makatugon. Tanging sa paglinang ng mahusay na pagkamatuwid na makakaya ng mga tao na mag-alay ng walang pag-iimbot na panatang ekolohikal. May pagkamarangal ang tungkulin sa pangangalaga ng sangnilikha sa pamamagitan ng maliliit na pagkilos araw-araw at kahanga-hanga kung paanong nagdala ng totoong pagbabago sa paraan ng pamumuhay. #Buhay Laudato Si.
Thank you so much. And moving on to our open forum, here is Ma'am Jack to moderate. Ma'am Jack.
Hi everyone. I just like to, before we move on to the set of questions that are in the chat box that was sent, the subject matter that we're talking about is really about integral ecological conversion in the time of COVID, but speaking in terms of economic recovery. So my question would go for the three as an opinion. So let's begin with Majo and Jerome, and then to Father Walter. Do you think there is space for integral ecological conversion in Phoenician economy?
Sorry, could you repeat that? You got cut off.
Do you think there is a space for integral ecological conversion in Phoenician economy? Because the subject matter, really, the title of this conversation is integral ecological conversion. And but if we look into the elements of your presentation, where exactly can we locate that ecological Keynesian conversion in the proposal that you were presenting?
Right. Would it be possible, just because perhaps I'm ignorant, would it be possible to clarify what exactly you would mean by integral ecological conversion?
Perhaps you can ask Father Walpole,
Right.
expand more on this. It would be good,
Right.
Because
So
Father Walpole, if there were three elements of integral ecological conversion, what would this be, Father Walpole?
We first of all have to understand what is integral.
Yeah.
Do we actually understand that we're integral beings on the landscape where we live? I always put things in a landscape. You know, you talk to kids in schools here in Manila, they don't know where their water comes from. That's not integral living.
Right.
You know? Do we understand where our food comes from? Do we actually know what the farmer is paid for? I am sure if you go through the roads in the highlands of Bukidnon, Calabasa is rotting at the side of the road. Farmers have spent months growing this, but they're not integrated into the economy. They're integrated into what the market wants from them. So, do we know, does our living integrate with the squatter areas? Or does just all our waste go there and our dirty water? Do we actually live an integrated life? If we live an integrated life, then somewhere our heart and not just our mind comes into the answers.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Father Walpole.
And the conversion means you can see the difference between yourself and who you were before.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Maybe I can start with, I guess I can be the first one to answer the question. So, well, first of all, I guess when we said yes to this particular presentation, we began with the idea that it's really we wanted to focus on the issues of the pandemic, and that is why we aligned our presentation with the policies that we think would address the current situation, the most urgent needs of our public health emergency. However, it doesn't mean that it cannot be, the current discourses on how we can respond to the needs of this current public health emergency cannot be expanded so as to make it more sustainable. So when I introduced when I gave the overview, I said that this was actually a call for not just investments, not just think about what sectors we should invest in, but also a call for everyone across the Philippines, across the world, from different sectors, from different provinces, how we can better think about the vulnerable and thinking about farmers, fisher folk, and other sectors very close to to Mother Earth. Now, to answer the question of how we integrate the two, I have two levels of answer to that. First, we usually think of ecological problems in economics as market failures. So perhaps, I don't know if you feel that's a bit biased because there's still a market. So the underlying model is still from the economy. But because we have to bridge the private sector and private consumers to the problems of the environment, we explain, for instance, pollution as a case of this so-called negative externality situation. When we talk about something, I guess something that less technical would be the case of resource depletion. For instance, overfishing is a case of the so-called tragedy of the commons, wherein what happens is it's a market failure because people, fisher folk, maybe because of the lack of guidance and the lack of information about the population of fish, right, of fish resources, overfish because of competition, because there are large commercial fishings, because there's just a lot of them in that particular area, it leads to the depletion of the fish resource. So that's a market failure. And in basic economics, we teach it to our students that there are policies like capping how much you can fish, giving licenses to fishermen, to fisher folk, so that they don't overfish. There are ways for us to bridge these two things. So that's my first answer.
Okay, thank
Explaining
you.
the
Yeah.
entirety.
Sure,
Just
sure.
the other thing, maybe that's the first thing, and then maybe Jerry can say more about
Yeah,
that.
yeah. I mean, it
It's a
was
very
good that you
difficult
gave
question.
Yeah,
Right.
because
I
the
love
subject matter is very difficult. Hold on a bit,
Right.
Jerome. But thank you for giving a very concrete example, Majo, no, that where we deal, for example, with the failure of market forces. There are also alternatives to that, like as you said, when you're able to understand that relationship, there's a solution to it. Let's say capping, open season and closed season in fishing can be one that reflects on the relationship between humans and ecology, and at the same time the intent really to make a significant change in that practice. Yes, Jerome, you were about to say something.
Right. I would say when it comes to Keynesian economics, I would have some level of ambivalence, because I do believe that even our current situation, that we do need to rethink, and we need a government response in our midst. But at the same time, if you go back to the context of Keynesian economics, it was not, I would say it, in a sense, it was about saving capitalism rather than transcending it. So that's something important to consider. Now, is there something in Keynesianism nonetheless that can still point us, in the direction of what you're talking about, integral economic conversion, ecological conversion? And I would say the most important thing with COVID, what it's done, and what a Keynesian response can do, is that it forces us to think about what's truly essential for all of us. Think about it. If you're talking about essential workers, frontliners, are these hedge fund managers? Are these bankers? Are these CEOs? No, they're nurses, they're teachers, they're the traffic aides, they're the people in the stores. These are the essential things that we need to see. Many of the things that we've seen in our modern economies are in this very moment of time. They are not essential to us. We will not survive by them. They can perhaps enrich our lives in certain ways, but what we find now in this crisis is that we cannot bank on them to get us through a very, very mortal period. Now, what can Keynesian economics do? It's not so much about us. It's not about it in itself, but maybe it gives us a tool to refocus our economy on what truly matters. And that's why we emphasize public investment, public spending. There are massive market failures, there are massive inequalities. And throughout all the years, we have neglected our schools, we've neglected our health system, we've neglected taking care of our environment. Now, Keynesian economics in itself will not tell us to take care of the environment. In fact, it was formed in a world war. You know, it is destroying the environment. But sometimes even these kind of can be a tool to help us refocus. The question really is, what kind of values will we have when we're using these tools? That's what I think is the core.
Yeah, thank you very much, for that very valuable insight. And for those of us who are following the discussion, Jerome just actually pointed us to the direction that there are many schools of thought, about development and how change is going to happen. But Keynesian economics actually focuses on public investment. And the thing about public investment, particularly the state investments, is that they have an obligation for public good. It's not very specific for private interests alone, but generally for the public good, because it's the government that's investing. So what Jerome and Majo were pointing to us is the direction of where government is supposed to invest at this time of recovery. So there are a couple of questions here, that we want to if you're, I'll call out your name and perhaps you can read your question. So I'd like to call on Romeo Reyes. Romeo wants to have a question particularly on insurance. Romeo? But Romeo's question is really about the importance of the role of the insurance industry in this pandemic, particularly when you're looking at affected employees.
Right.
Yes.
So what should be the role right now? Or
yes,
unemployment
of the insurance
or...
industry, yes.
Okay, yeah. Wow, that's a... I'm not
Very
an
specific question.
I'm not an insurance guy. I focus more on development rather than the finance industry. But what I can say...
Let's do it this way. I'll read the set of questions that are here. And if people would want to raise their own question, please just say so. Right. There's a related question. The questions are actually moving around in different directions.
Yeah.
But what is the role of the insurance industry? The other question is the role of construction. Particularly, there's a lot of emphasis on this, and your presentation covered that. There's a question on the role of agriculture in particular, and what particular changes should there be in the agricultural sector. And there's a particular question on the role of indigenous peoples.
Okay, so insurance,
so we're looking at
agriculture,
yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So any one of you can respond, but yeah. Okay.
Would you
start.
like? Do you have any ideas, Majo? I can also go.
So I can start. A bit with insurance, perhaps, as Jerry said, we're both from DevEcon, very DevEcon. But perhaps on insurance, it would really depend on how this would play out in terms of the WHO pronouncement that we shared a while ago. If this becomes part of the usual stock of diseases that becomes part of what we face as human beings every day for the rest of our lives, then it becomes part of, perhaps, we really don't know, but it can become part of the things covered by insurance companies in the future, right? If that's the question, if that is what's being asked by the question. In terms of the other sector that were mentioned, I think the main message from us in relation to sustainable development and integration of the economy and the ecology, there's a lot of room for targeting certain types of sectors within the construction sector, the agricultural sector, that can become more sustainable, that are more sustainable. And hence, we hope given our framing of the policies in terms of a response to the pandemic, it's actually something that we could take as an opportunity to also make our sectors, especially those very close to the environment, to the natural resources, to be more sustainable as well. So like what Jeric gave us examples a while ago, yung coconut, the abaca production, these things could be supported by the government, could be targeted by the private sector in a way that's sustainable. And the problem here, I guess, would be how we can ensure that the paradigms that we need are gonna be followed, that the values of sustainability and inclusiveness and solidarity would dominate these targeted investments from the government and the public sector.
Okay.
Private sector.
Okay, before Chakra responds, there's a related question, and perhaps you can answer this, Jerry. So obviously your presentation is now pushing us to the direction, of investments in agriculture. But of course, there's also a need to balance this because infrastructure will be needed. Like farm to market roads, etc. How do you now balance this from an economic perspective when you're doing a recovery program?
Balance it
So
with
that's the question.
Balance it with
This
the environment.
question is from Richard Famadico. So how do you balance the the call for the agribusiness and still the need for infrastructure?
Okay, right. Ultimately, what we try to approach it with is number one, principles that we believe that you need to find to understand what your priorities are. And we are guided in the economics department by principles of equity, inclusivity, solidarity, sustainability. But at the same time, you also need to understand what the data will allow you to work with. Now, in regards to agribusiness and I think in regards to the sector, allow me to comment what I thought was very important with to build on what Majo was saying on agriculture. Some of the biggest challenges, and goes also with what Father Pedro was saying, are not only, and the reason why some of our farmers are so poor is really questions of distribution. When you're talking about traders who farmers have no other option to lend to, they have no access to finance, they have no capacity, no ability to be able to make the most of their farms, and all of this could be easily addressed if government were actually to step in to be able to ensure that there's adequate competition between different traders, that farmers have supplies such as irrigation, proper seeds, equipment, which are sustainable, so on and so forth. Now, how do you balance all of those? Our view when it comes to the question of business in this case is ultimately that we must start with the approach that will engage the most people. That's why we emphasize the question of jobs in the agriculture sector. Many Filipinos, millions and millions, are displaced, and we need to figure out. It would be nice if can easily be, they can find jobs again in the cities. But the challenge now is that we're not sure if those industries will be able to find ways to employ them. Now, what approaches will be better for that? I don't think it will be a very high-intensive agriculture approach. It should be something which can absorb as much people as possible. And that I think should be the balance point. If I can also give a quick comment, the insurance industry is in finance, but I do believe that the insurance industry has a major responsibility now, given that so many people are disrupted, they're experiencing all kinds of shocks, that it lives up to its commitments. It's possible, we all know it when it comes to the insurance industry. Many of them suddenly say, oh, force majeure, some other clause that they no longer cover you. They need to maintain that kind of responsibility in this context so that people will not be entirely disrupted. I believe in the construction side, Macho has given a good reminder on that. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much,
Can I just also
Jerry.
comment?
Yeah, very brief, Majo, because I want to give time for Father Walpole before we close.
Yeah,
Q&A.
very brief lang po. Kasi, so, the issue on balancing as well. So if we're saying that we should focus on agri, but at the same time, we also said that we should focus on certain types of BBB projects that would actually support agri think about it, as well as BBB projects that would support the health sector. So what we're saying here is that we hope that government tries to provide a very comprehensive study of what needs to be invested on in a way that they're all connected. So there has to be that idea that these are all connected
Yeah.
issues,
Integrative
sectors.
planning. Integrative planning.
Yeah, sorry, that's what we're saying. So balance should be there, but at the same time, the balance would come from understanding what are the linkages across the sectors that we deem to be essential, not just for pandemic, but also for sustainable development and inclusive development.
Okay. May I first go to Father Walpole? Father, I mean, you were asked the question earlier on what do you think is the role of, see, when we're talking about the government per se, we're only talking about one stakeholder in the, you know, in governance. But there are many actually left behind in this conversation that we're doing right now. And one of the questions here was really particularly for IPs and other stakeholders. You know, what do you think is the role in this recovery process, Father?
Sorry, I didn't get the question because the
question was, what's the role, what can be the role of indigenous peoples and other marginalized communities in this whole economic recovery process?
One, they require respect and dignity. So the most basics are not always there in our society. We look down on them. Yeah, this is where fundamental conversion has to happen, because that is not there. Now, the indigenous people know much more about water as it is generated. So their lands, and it is their lands whether they have catses or not, because that's all they've been left with. Their lands are really the sources of water for everyone. So if we do not give them fair prices, and more of their land is taken over as migrants come up from the cities, and that is happening at the moment. This is the pressure of the corn industry in the uplands to create animal feeds. We keep shifting into the forest, and that forest is sacred to the indigenous, but we do not recognize it because it means money to others. We're building roads through it. We're fragmenting the whole biodiversity. Mm-hmm. Yeah. How do we help the indigenous hold their land, which is sacred to them, and hold the forests which generate the water? Yeah. So their main role is in, none of them are paid as forest guards. Pay them as forest guards, as water security officers, because that's where our major resource comes from. We do not see their value. Yeah, we erode their culture and break down their culture and their systems. They do not belong in the cities. They belong with their ancestors. Mm-hmm. Yeah, in a living culture, in a living world. So we need conversion. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Neither these indigenous people nor the farmers below them have any insurance. Insurance doesn't work for small farmers. So they lose a crop in a typhoon or in a drought. Yeah, that's total misfortune. But the company can take out insurance. And insurance is a major factor now, particularly in international agriculture. But the poor farmer doesn't benefit for that. We need systems, not just traders. We need systems that invest in our people, not just in agricultural crops. We need an agricultural department that is really an agroforestry department.
Okay, Father.
That integration is needed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry to rush this because we're about, we're running out of time, but that was a very insightful input. Just for our resource persons, one question: if there are many post-COVID economic recovery bills being put out in the open, if there was one thing, one particular policy that you would want to push for, what would that be? For all our three resource persons, can you say that in a Miss Universe fashion? 20 seconds, please. Yeah.
Okay, who goes first?
I can go first. Following the last slide that we shared to you, the overarching policy would be to place our economy towards an agriculture-driven economy. It doesn't mean na yun lang. It doesn't mean that it's all gonna be just agri. It doesn't mean that we don't focus on the farmers. Sorry, that we just focus on crops. But it's a start, right? The discourse can start from there, how we can better that idea of an agri-driven economy. So it's not just for us to say kung anong dapat, what should happen. I think there are people from the ground who can really make the policies much better. What do we mean by agri-driven economy?
Okay. Thank you very much, Majo. Yes, Jerry.
Maybe not a policy, but a paradigm.
Okay.
Because you know, there can be so many policies for one paradigm, but we only have one, so I go for a paradigm. We need an economy that goes from privileging the few to those that really goes towards the marginalized. That's really the point which I want to emphasize. Whether you're talking about indigenous peoples, whether you're talking about farmers, whether you're talking about flexible labor, all of these people have been marginalized, and we are all much more vulnerable now because they are on the margins. That's what this pandemic has done to us. If we cannot bring them, if we cannot change our economy to give them a bigger role, then we will continue to be in this position of vulnerability. Their vulnerability is our vulnerability.
Thank you. I'll move on to the next question. The next question is, what can you say about the Balik Probinsya project?
You want one word answer to that?
Yes, just 20-second answer, because that's in the chat box. It's a question from who did that? Marites Kunanan. Yes.
It's a false solution. False solution. That's basically it. It's a cosmetic device which doesn't change the reason why so many people go to cities in the first place. And that's ultimately that we've neglected agriculture for the greatest time. Really. To give you one example, I can go on. I mean, me and Majo have written about this.
Yes.
Whether in terms of investment, yeah. But
okay,
it's
so you don't think?
Gamut.
So do you think it's a good idea or not?
It's a waste of money. It's more of a political ploy for the 2022 elections.
Okay, then anyone who has questions about that, Marites, kindly email Jerry. Majo, do you want to say something about it?
I don't think that the proponents of this Balik Probinsya understand the problems faced by our farmers and fisher folk and all other people who came from the province. They don't understand why they're here trying to look for work. And that says a lot about we have a lot of questions about that, right? Yeah. So I guess that's all I can say for the given amount of time.
I think another challenge here is the proper approach and the politically expedient approach. Sometimes they can go together, but they go in such different directions. And if you think about it from a political point of view, it's a good move politically. You want people to be grateful for you, you give that to them. But they will go back eventually to the city because ultimately the opportunities are not there. We need a more fundamental change.
Okay, great. There's one question we need to ask from you. From Jem Cadiz. I don't know if this is all the way from Melbourne or it's just the tag here, but she'd want an opinion on the whole, Keynesian approach. What do you think is the role of local government units?
Right.
Because in a, Keynesian concept, it's really just national government, driving all of this. What would be the role of local governments in this case?
When it comes to the question of local government, we have very, very mixed experiences in the Philippines. Some of them perform extremely well. I think we can take a look at LGUs such as Pasig, which has really taken a lead. Marikina, where Majo lives, is a great example of which has an empowered mayor. But you have other areas where people have not received proper goods. Now, what the role is? Keynesian economics can still be for local government. Local governments can spend, whether in terms of local infrastructure, in terms of local agriculture, local health. These are all under the local government code in the Philippines, responsibilities in which LGU have a major role. So ultimately, it depends on the local chief executive. What does he or she, along with this, and if he or she, along with the Sangguniang, are they proactive in that? In some areas, they are. In other areas, dynasties, which may not be the most forward-looking in this regard. I would say the role for national government, especially with local government, is to provide a proper framework in this case. Challenge is,
Okay, so provide a proper framework and that would really overhaul, that would facilitate the conversion, integral conversion
and to encourage them to do better.
Yeah, and to encourage local government units. Majo, would you want to add something to that? And then Rodney would like to add something to that. Yes, Majo.
Yeah, like what Jeric said, the LGUs could also spend. So they also have a mandate for social services, if I'm remembering my local code. So it's really just a matter of trying to distinguish between what's the role of the national government and what's the role of the local government, because there are differences in terms of what they're supposed to be providing in terms of public services.
Okay. Yeah, Rodney, yes, please.
Very short, Ma'am Jack. Just a comment on the general, in relation to the IP sector and different sectors, and in relation to that question. The biggest fault of the national government in addressing this pandemic from February until today is that the voice of the local government units and the civil society, they are not heard. There's no representation when it comes to policy and decision-making process of the IITF. So that's why the anxiety, the worry, and all of the confusions of the local government units, they can feel it. Because there's no voice, no civil society representation at the IITF, no LGU representation at the IITF. And I think that's one, I think one of the policies that they need to think about on how to have a whole government approach and bottom-up approach as well.
Yeah. Thank you for raising that, Rodney. Although this might be a subject matter for a next webinar for you. Actually the policies are right there, providing the spaces for civil society. My question in return for civil society organizations is, how did we use those political spaces in the time of COVID? How did we use them? I think that's for another webinar, for us to reflect on. But just one question, we keep talking about agriculture, giving it a priority. But if you look at it from a risk perspective, and you all know the formula for that: hazard, exposure, vulnerability. The greatest exposure is in the urban areas.
The greatest risk?
Yeah, the greatest risk.
Okay.
Yeah, if you do the math, on hazard, exposure, vulnerability, the risk will be in those urban centers because that is where it's densely populated. That is where most of the investments are currently, and we've actually seen their susceptibility also at the time of COVID. The people in the rural areas, many of them like fisher folk, those in agriculture, did not go as hungry as the ones in the city. Okay. So my question for you is, in terms of looking at prioritization, what do we do about the urban sector?
Right.
Because we kept talking about the agricultural sector. And the only interventions that we need in the rural sector were garments. We cannot compete anymore with other Asian countries on the garment industry. Yeah.
Right.
So what do we do with the urban sector? Any suggestions?
If you go back to the history of urban planning, the reason why urban planning emerged as a discipline was to respond to public health challenges. Really, that was the epidemics of cholera in the turn of the 19th century. It took an epidemiologist to make the case precisely that we need to have our cities planned. we were talking about transportation. Our transportation system in Metro Manila, public transport, is a market failure. There's really not much government coordination. I mean, not that there should be direct government control over the bus system, but they're all redundant. And we can take a look also when it comes to risk. Risk is socially produced. It's in a fact when developers do not follow the land use plan and build in riskier areas, and those who are not able to find places to live in within the city, such as the informal settlers, are forced to live in the risky zones, precisely because the city has not been planned to be able to accommodate most people in that case. So ultimately, this is also a wake-up call for the urban planning situation in the Philippines. And the government, more than anything, it is a call for local governments to be able to address also plan for future public health challenges so that we will all be more resilient in that regard. So just a thought. Of course, you can also have a lot of investments when it comes to roads, but ultimately, we have left the development of our cities too much to whatever happens in the market. So now it's time for us to bring it back under the public sector, and an accountable public sector at that, which responds to the people. I think Jack is having internet trouble right now.
Yeah, maybe you can answer while waiting.
Yeah.
Siguro in terms of phases, right? In terms of stages, how we should answer the urban problem in terms of COVID. In terms of the emergency stage, yung ngayon, yung public health crisis stage, social amelioration is really important. And then as we transition towards reopening, we have to start thinking about what would help our workers go back to work by ensuring their safety. So the issues on guidelines for occupational hazards and safety is there. And in the longer term, I think it's really about structural reform, which is again based on not food, not just crop production, but agro-industrial development, as Jeric have pointed out in our presentation. So in the longer term, hopefully it's not just an empty balik probinsya program, but there's now going to be a paradigm shift about what the rural development, how the rural development can be, and that people, the farmers, would find dignity in their work in the future. But we have to work for that. That is not something that can happen overnight. And that is something that we have to plan for. But definitely, yung problem with the urban sector right now, social amelioration and safety and hazards guidelines for them.
Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. I kind of dropped off in a while. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So having said that, all of that, thank you very much. Okay. We've had a very enriching discussion, and thank you all for your questions. I'm sorry I cannot read everything, but they were very insightful. So wrapping this up, we'd like to thank all of the resource persons that we have. But just to say that the speakers really took us through the analysis of what economic recovery entails, among which are really the need, of course, for the role of government, which we question in the end, because we're saying that it shouldn't just be government, it should be also about the role of other stakeholders, including civil society organizations and the indigenous peoples. The policies the pathway that we need to take, if it's the government making those changes, is really to look into policies and programs and paradigms that would lead us to that integral ecological conversion that we have. And it's in the specificity of those particular policies, programs, and paradigms that we need to crucially examine. By that, we're saying is that we often talk about big words, about conversion and change and change of paradigm. But what the program says right now is looking into those details of policies, programs, that we need to examine. And more importantly, that the words of integral ecological conversation should no longer remain on the level of theory. It needs to go down to the level of practice, you know, to the different layers of examples that were given to us by different resource persons. And I'd like to leave, you know, that it's a very complex picture that our resource persons have shown us, you know, that in as much as we want to look into the role of government and governance at the same time, and the role of the economy, we should not forget that at the heart of these are people and environment. And that is where the connectedness that Living Laudato Si is taking us. No, that is the direction that it is taking us. We need to see the connectedness between government, economy, people, you know, and the environment as a whole. And with that, I leave you with this reflection, and I'll turn you now over to Rodney. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jack. And really, I would like to thank Majo, Jeric, and Father Pedro for sharing all their insights with everyone. But before we close, I just would like to ask Majo for any short closing message.
Okay, thank you, Rod. I guess I return to how I opened our presentation tonight. In alignment with what Ma'am Jack is also saying, that in our issues, not just in our public health crisis that we are facing right now, we are now given an opportunity, a chance to reimagine how our economic trajectory would look like, to make it more inclusive, to make it more sustainable, and in the same way, to allow people that we don't usually allow to take part to actually contribute to economic growth and recovery, as we focus our efforts towards something that's more agri-driven, something that is more closer to our indigenous peoples, to our small farmers, to our fisher folk. So everyone is really called to think about defining and shaping this new normal, and we have that chance to make it more sustainable, more inclusive, and more towards the spirit of Bayanihan and our Filipino nation, towards our Filipino nation home.
My last message on this is that really we have to put the margins at the center, whatever economy we're working with, and that any policy comes in, any impact on the environment must be paid for. And consumers should absorb this in the light of COVID and continuing ecological crisis.
Thank you, Father. And I would like also to request our official partner, Eco Jesuits. They have the representative here, Brex Arevalo. You have the floor.
Hello. Can everyone hear me? Just a real quick word from Eco Jesuit. Thank you for everyone who joined this webinar. We'd like to invite you to continue the discussion. We hope that you can log into ecojesuit.com. We're also available on Facebook and Twitter. We would like to continue the discussion with you. We are exploring different collaborations from local to global. We're trying to bring local stories to the fore, upward to the global scene. As mentioned earlier, we're currently running a series of dialogues where we're trying to highlight the different regional experiences and concerns when it comes to COVID, and connecting that with the older ecological crisis, if you may. So yes, thank you everyone, and I hope you learned something, and we hope to collaborate with you further.
And lastly, I just would like to call in Sheen, our engagement officer, to share something before we end.
Hi, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sheen again from Living Laudato Si Philippines. In celebration of Laudato Si Week, we still have two remaining webinar sessions, and they are May 21. It's on Thursday, Laudato Si Schools Towards Ecological Citizenship. Our culminating activity, webinar session, will be on Sunday. It's about sustainable development goals and Laudato Si towards eco-solidarity. And please get in touch with us, join the conversation. Please follow us on our social media accounts on Facebook, Living Laudato Si, Twitter at Laudato Si, and Instagram at Laudato Si PH. And you can also send us some message via email, info@livinglaudatosI.org.ph, and please do visit our website, www.livinglaudatosI.ph, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much, Sheen, and would like to thank my colleagues of Living Laudato Si Philippines, Rexer and Sheen, for organizing all of this, and of course, everyone. And don't forget also to visit www.laudatosiweek.org for more events, and also the Facebook page of GCCM, and among others. And for our closing activity, let's pray together the Oratio Imperata.
Oratio Imperata. God our Father, we come to you in our need to ask your protection against the 2019 coronavirus that has claimed lives and has affected many. We pray for your grace for the people tasked with studying the nature and cause of this virus and its disease, and of stemming the tide of its transmission. Guide the hands and minds of medical experts that they may minister to the sick with competence and compassion, and of those governments and private agencies that must find cure and solution to this epidemic. We pray for those afflicted. May they be restored to health soon. Grant us the grace to work for the good of all and to help those in need. Grant this through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, God forever and ever. Amen. Mary, help of all Christians, pray for us. Saint Raphael the Archangel, pray for us. Saint Roch, pray for us. Saint Lorenzo Ruiz, pray for us. Saint Pedro Calungsod, pray for us.
And again, thank you so much for joining us. And your e-certificates will be sent to you after you've done your evaluation forms, to be sent also to everyone. And we thank you, and we will see you on the 21st for Laudato Si Schools, and on the 24th for SDGs and Laudato Si towards eco-solidarity. Thank you so much, Eco-Jesuits, Christian Aid, and the Global Catholic Climate Movement. Don't forget, we are all interconnected. Thank you, and good evening to all of you.